Hi everyone, this is Miss Moore and today we are continuing our genetics unit with a lesson on patterns of inheritance. The focus of today's lesson will be how traits are passed from parent to offspring and why some traits are visible while others are not. We're going to start with two warm-up questions to remind us of important concepts we've already learned in the unit so far. Question 1, what is a gene? And question 2, what does the length and sequence of a gene determine? Please pause the lesson video here while you do your warm-up questions. A gene is a section of the DNA sequence that codes for a specific protein. If you imagine DNA like a long ladder 1.8 meters in length, a gene would be one section of it that codes for the proteins required for a specific trait to be displayed by the organism, such as eye color. The length and sequence of the gene determine the complexity and the size of the protein that it codes for. More nitrogen bases mean more complex proteins. So far in this unit, we've been focused on your genome at a molecular level, down to the nitrogen bases and the genes and the chromosomes and the chromatin and all that which is going on inside your cells right now that codes for who you are as an individual and what you look like. In today's lesson, we're taking a step back to look at the connection between your genome and your physical appearance and also how traits are passed down from one generation of organisms to the next. This entire branch of science that we're learning about right now, genetics, began with a monk named Gregor Mendel back in the 1800s. Mendel was a monk, and he was a very well-educated monk. He had studied science and mathematics at the University of Vienna, and afterwards he was working at a monastery, and he was particularly interested in the garden. And that's because in the garden there was a whole lot of pea plants, hundreds of them actually, and Mendel was very interested in pea plants because if you know anything about genetics, you know that these are one of the most popular organisms used to study how traits are passed from parents to offspring. Mendel was looking for a pattern in the way in which these characteristics were inherited by the offspring plants. What's great about pea plants is that they don't take very long to reach maturity, so he could study multiple generations of pea plants in a very short time. Pea plants also have a wide variety of characteristics called traits, which you can study. Traits are specific characteristics of an organism. For pea plants, some common traits include how tall the plants grow, the color of their seeds, or the shape of their seeds. There's actually quite a few characteristics which we'll look at in a moment. Before we can talk about the offspring generation of pea plants, we have to talk about where they came from. How do pea plants make babies? There are two different ways. Pea plants pollinate themselves as pollen from the male reproductive structure called the stamen lands on the female reproductive structure called the pistil. You can see these structures in the diagram here. When the plant interacts with itself in this way, it's called self-pollination. But plants can also engage in reproduction with other plants. This is called cross-pollination, and all that's required for this to happen is for the pollen to be transported from one plant to another. That could happen because the pollen is carried on the wind, or by helpful insects like bees, or humans can interfere, which is exactly what Gregor Mendel did. He was able to transfer the pollen from one plant to a different plant so that he could choose very specifically who the parent plants would be in that cross. In this way, Mendel was able to cross plants with different traits, very specific traits, so that he could study how the offspring looked. In his experiments, Mendel was very curious as to why sometimes the baby pea plants looked like the parents and sometimes they didn't. So he classified these possibilities into two outcomes. He said either we have a situation of true breeding, where the baby plant looks like the parent plant, or we have a situation where the plants are not breeding true. So plants that are true breeding are those where the offspring have the same traits as the parent, and plants that do not breed true have offspring with different characteristics. Before we can really get into this, we have to identify the different levels of offspring because Mendel would take parents and make babies and then have those babies make babies and then those babies would make babies. And so we actually have an organized classification system for how to identify all of these different generations. So the first two plants that were ever crossed together are the parental generation, also known as the P gen, and then the offspring from those plants are called the first filial generation or F1 gen. And it goes downwards like that. So if the F1 gen make babies, those are the second filial or F2 generation, and so on. So if we have to summarize this, we can say P gen, F1 gen, F2 gen, and so on, F3, F4, etc. And in the diagram below here, you can see an example of what that would look like. For example, you could have a tall plant and a short plant forming the P generation, and then whatever their babies look like is called the F1 generation. And if you took babies from F1 and had them make babies with each other, you would get the F2 generation, and so on. So one of Mendel's most famous experiments involved a tall plant and a short plant in the P gen. And he found that when you crossed a tall plant with a short plant, you would get all tall plant babies. So every plant in the F1 gen was tall. There was no short babies. But what he found so strange was that if you took the F1 gen and cross-pollinated them, in the F2 gen, there was usually a few short babies. So what Mendel said about the F1 generation in this case was that the pea plants were not breeding true. Why? How could this be? Well, he reasoned that the tall parent plants, these guys here, must have some sort of short factor, a secret recipe for shortness that could be passed along to their offspring, but that wouldn't be visible in that organism itself. We now understand that these secret factors are actually just the information stored in your genes. And further, some genes can be considered more powerful than others and can override other genes. Here's an example that challenges you to start identifying what traits are more powerful, quote, quote, than others. Using the images of the pea plants below, try to determine which traits are more powerful for each characteristic. These are the characteristics here: seed shape, seed color, pod shape, etc. And the options for each characteristic are listed underneath it. So seeds could be round or wrinkled, seeds could be yellow or green. Use the information in this table in combination with these modern day images of pea plants to try and figure out which traits are more powerful than others. Pause the video here while you do it. The results of this exercise might be surprising to you because it's in fact all of these traits in the top section of your table which are the most powerful, and the ones below are the weak ones. But I'm sure you would have seen in the images that there are some strange coincidences, like if green seeds are the weaker trait, why are all the seeds green? And that's because we've decided we like green peas more than yellow peas. So we started breeding together all the plants that made green peas until now it's pretty rare to see a yellow pea. So just because a trait is weak doesn't mean that it's rare. And likewise, if a trait is powerful, it doesn't mean that it's common. For example, brown hair is a more powerful trait than red hair, and yet in Scotland, being red-headed is the most common hair color. Similarly, in Norway, People mainly have blue or green eyes, which is actually a weaker eye color than brown. So next we're going to learn how this is happening at the genetic level. Okay, so back to the tall and short pea plant. Mendel concluded that when he crossed two true breeding plants with opposite traits, like one true breeding tall plant and one true breeding short plant, the offspring plants only showed one of those traits, such as tallness. So he said, okay, the tall trait seems to be stronger than the short trait. And we have an official word for this in genetics, which is dominant. The stronger trait is called the dominant trait, and the weaker one is called the recessive trait. I'm going to highlight this sentence because it's very important. When one trait is stronger than another and overrides it completely, this is a pattern of inheritance called complete dominance, which we're going to look at now in detail. And I'm also going to highlight this sentence. So are you telling me I had a short option or a tall option? Well, for humans it's more complicated, but in pea plants it really is that simple. They have a short option and a tall option right there in their genes. Where do they get these two options from? Well, from their biological parents. Every organism has two options, and these options are called alleles. Alleles are alternative forms of a gene, and you got one of them from each of your biological parents. Geneticists use letter symbols to represent the different alleles. A dominant allele is represented by a capital letter, and you always choose the letter based on the dominant trait. So if you're doing height, you would not choose H, you would choose T, T for tall. And the recessive allele for short would be the lowercase version of that letter. In this case, little t represents shortness. So in the diagram below here, you can see we have a tall plant, which has the alleles big T, and we have a short plant, which has the alleles little t. So because these are the same letter, these are called true breeding organisms, also known as purebreds. And their offspring, which form the F1 gen, have blended alleles, big T, little t, where the dominant one, tallness, is what's expressed physically. Whenever you have two different letters for your alleles, you're known as a hybrid. If you have time, I strongly recommend watching the video titled Mendelian Inheritance, available on YouTube at this link. It goes into this in more detail, and it's really an interesting video. For traits that follow complete dominance, meaning that one allele completely overrides the other, you can actually predict your odds at getting offspring exhibiting different traits. So this involves using probability to predict the results of genetic crosses. And we do this using a special chart called the Punnett Square, which is used to show all the possible gene combinations of the F1 gen. This chart system was developed by Reginald Punnett, an English geneticist, and to demonstrate it, let's just take the example of guinea pigs because they're super cute. So imagine that a black guinea pig mated with a white guinea pig. If the dominant fur color in guinea pigs is black, then what are the chances of having a white offspring? Let's assume that these guinea pigs are purebred, meaning that they're going to have the same letter for their alleles for their fur color gene. So parent 1, if it's a black guinea pig, will have big B, and parent 2 as a white guinea pig would have little b, because black is the dominant fur color and white is the recessive fur color. So now we construct our Punnett square. And when we do this, the top section is for parent 1, and the section on the side is for parent 2. And the outcome for the F1 generation goes in this section of the square here. So it doesn't matter which parent you put where. We'll put our black guinea pig across the top and our white guinea pig down the side. And to complete each section of the square, you simply say, okay, big B and little b would make big B little b. And big B little b would make big B little b, and so on. So out of the 4 options we had for our offspring, all 4 were big B little b. As a fraction, that's equivalent to 1 whole. And how do we change a fraction to a percent? We multiply by 100%. So 100% of our offspring are expected to be big B little b. This means that they're going to have black fur. It also means that 100% of the F1 generation are hybrids because they have 2 different letters for their fur color gene. However, if you compared these black babies to their black parent, you would not be able to tell them apart from a purebred black guinea pig. Their physical appearance is the same, but their gene compositions are different, and we have special terms for each of these things. The physical appearance of an organism is called its phenotype. The gene composition is called the genotype. I'm going to highlight that sentence because it's very important. Here's an example for you to try on your own. If 2 black hybrid guinea pigs were bred, what is the probability that they will have a white purebred offspring? Use a Punnett square to support your answer. Please pause the video here while you try this example. If our P generation is 2 black hybrid guinea pigs, then we're crossing a big B little b guinea pig with another one of the same type. And when you sketch out your Punnett square, you'll see that one of the squares is a white guinea pig little b. So if one of the 4 options is a white purebred guinea pig, this is equivalent to 0.25. And how do we change that to a percent? We multiply by 100. So we have a 25% chance of a BB white purebred guinea pig. Next, we're going to watch a short video on YouTube called Gregor Mendel, available at this link here, and respond to the following questions while we watch the video. How is a gene related to an allele? Provide examples of the following gene possibilities in terms of big Y, little y for heterozygous, homozygous dominant, and homozygous recessive. How is an organism's genotype different from its phenotype? And what will the color phenotype be for the following pea plants where green is dominant and yellow is recessive? Please pause the lesson here while you watch the video. Okay, let's double check our answers. A gene is a section of DNA that codes for a specific protein, while an allele is a variation of that gene. For every gene, we have 2 alleles, one from each of our biological parents. Heterozygous would be big Y, little y, which up until this point, we've also called hybrid. You can use these interchangeably. Homozygous dominant would be big Y, and homozygous recessive would be little y, which up until this point we've called purebred. An organism's genotype is their allele combination, while their phenotype is their physical appearance. And last question, if green is completely dominant over yellow, then a big G organism would be green, a big G organism would be green, and little g organism would be yellow. Okay, everyone, that's it for today's lesson. It's time to start your assignment. Please don't forget to check your solutions before turning in your work. Bye for now.